A retired Navy SEAL came home to sign away his late father's house, but a glint in the blizzard stopped him. Under a frozen pine tree, he found a chained German shepherd using her last strength to protect a tiny puppy. On her collar was the name of the best friend who had died saving his life 12 years ago. Then the dog led him to an abandoned mail truck, a missing old mailman, and letters meant for forgotten veterans. But the cruelest secret was hidden in one red letter, a letter someone had torn apart to keep him broken. Sometimes God sends a loyal dog into the storm to lead a wounded heart home. But what did his father know before he died? Where are you watching from? If this story touches your heart, please hit like and subscribe to help us reach 1,000 subscribers. The thing Mason Reed saw in the snow should not have moved. His headlights had only caught it for half a second. A small metallic flash low among the white pines, far off the main road, where no mailbox stood, no house light burned, and no sane person would have walked in a storm like this. At first, Mason thought it was a broken trail marker, one of those rusted signs the logging crews forgot after they carved roads through the northern woods of Brightwater Valley. Then the flash shifted. Not fell, not swung in the wind, shifted, like something alive had turned its head. Mason eased his old dark pickup onto the shoulder and let the engine idle. Snow drove sideways across the windshield in hard white streaks. Beyond the glass, the valley looked almost holy in its silence. Birch trunks pale as bone, black spruce heavy with snow, the frozen lake hidden somewhere below the tree line, and the roofs of distant homes softened into white humps beneath the storm. It was beautiful in the way a closed coffin could be beautiful, polished, quiet, and final. He should have kept driving. On the passenger seat lay a thick legal envelope from the Northern Hearth Veterans Foundation. The paper inside had been worded with the kind of polished kindness Mason distrusted on instinct. Confirmation of transfer, legacy preservation, community benefit. Final authorization required within 48 hours. His father's old house, the Reed place, the last stubborn piece of Thomas Reed left standing in Brightwater Valley, was waiting for Mason's signature. Mason had come back to sign it away, hand the past to people who claimed they would do something noble with it, and leave before anyone remembered his name with too much tenderness. He was 48 years old, tall at about 6'1", broad through the shoulders, with the hard, practical build of a man who had spent more years outdoors than behind desks. His skin was weathered and tanned even in winter, his face square and cut with strong lines that made strangers step aside before he ever raised his voice. Short dark brown hair, touched with salt and gray at the temples, stood slightly lifted in the front despite the damp cold. A thick salt and pepper stubble covered his jaw, chin, and upper lip, making him look rougher than he felt. His pale gray eyes were bright, deep-set, and steady, but there was a tiredness behind them that no one earned from age alone. He wore a green military-style camouflage button-up shirt with rolled sleeves, matching tactical cargo pants, and dark brown high field boots, clothes that still carried the discipline of the Navy SEAL he had been, even though the man inside them had spent 12 years trying not to remember what that discipline had cost. Mason looked again toward the trees. The metallic glint was gone. He told himself it was nothing. Ice, a can, a hunter's tag nailed to bark, but his right hand had already turned off the heater. His left had already taken the flashlight from the door pocket. Some old part of him, the part trained to listen when the world felt wrong, had spoken before the broken part could argue. He stepped out into the storm. The cold hit him like a slap. Snow hissed across the road and gathered in the creases of his boots. He crossed the ditch and pushed through the first line of trees, one arm raised against the wind. The beam of his flashlight cut through the whiteness in short, broken pieces. Branch, stump, snowbank, broken twig, then nothing. He moved carefully, not fast. Even now, years removed from combat, Mason read ground the way other men read newspapers. The snow told him things. A dragged line. Paw prints half filled. A boot print too deep at the heel. Someone had been here recently. Someone carrying weight or fear. Then he heard it. Not a bark. Not a growl. A low, broken breath. Mason stopped. The flashlight found her beneath a large white pine. A German shepherd stood chained to the trunk by a length of heavy steel links wrapped tight around the bark. She was black and tan, 6 years old perhaps, with the proud frame of a working dog, broad chest, strong legs, erect ears. But the storm had cut her down to bone and will. Snow clung to her dark saddle, crusted along her shoulders, and iced the whiskers around her long muzzle. Her amber-brown eyes held Mason with a terrible intelligence. She was trembling, but she did not collapse. She had planted herself over a small puppy curled beneath her belly, shielding it from the wind with the last heat in her body. The puppy was tiny, no more than a few weeks old, black and tan like its mother, but softer, rounder, with one ear folded and a small golden patch beneath its chin. It whimpered once, then tucked its nose deeper into the shelter of the older dog's chest. Later, Mason would know the shepherd's name was Libby, and the little one would be called Penny. In that first moment, they were simply 2 lives left in a storm that had no mercy. "Easy," Mason said, his voice low. The shepherd did not bark. She did not lunge. She did not bare her teeth. That made Mason more careful, not less. A frightened dog barked. A desperate dog bit. But this dog only watched him, as though she had been waiting for a man she knew only by scent, memory, or something deeper than either. Mason crouched several feet away and held out one gloved hand, palm down. "I'm not here to hurt you." The dog's nostrils moved. Her ears flicked toward the road, then back to Mason. She looked at his face. Then, slowly, painfully, she lowered her head and touched her nose to the sleeve of his camouflage shirt. The contact nearly undid him. It was such a small act of trust, and Mason had been trusted by too many dying things in his life. For a moment, he was not in Brightwater Valley anymore. He was 12 years younger, shoulder deep in smoke and snow on a mountain ridge far from home, hearing Eli Hart laugh once, actually laugh, while bullets chewed stone around them. Eli had been 40, broad-shouldered and warm-eyed, the kind of SEAL who could make a terrified young corpsman breathe by cracking a joke at the worst possible time. He had short, light brown hair, a square, open face, and an old paracord bracelet he never took off because his father had tied it for him before his first deployment. Eli had pulled Mason out of a kill zone with one arm bleeding and the other still firing. Then he had shoved Mason behind cover and turned back for a man who never made it out. Mason had lived. Eli Hart had not. A gust slammed snow through the pines, and Mason came back to the present with his hand clenched around nothing. The shepherd gave a weak push of her muzzle toward the puppy, then toward Mason's chest. Not asking for herself, asking for the little one. That was the moment Mason saw the collar. Old brown leather, cracked, scratched. Not the collar of a stray. A small metal tag hung from the front, half buried in ice. Mason brushed it clean with his thumb. Hart. R12. His breath stopped. Hart. The name sat in his hand like a live coal. "No," Mason whispered. The dog watched him, not confused, not startled. Waiting. Mason turned the tag over. The back was scored with rough cuts, as if someone had scratched the words in with a knife or a nail during panic, pain, or both. The letters were uneven, partly worn, but readable beneath the ice. Blue bag first. Mason stared at the words until they blurred. Blue bag. First, a message. Not a decoration. Not an accident. The storm pressed around them, and for the first time since he had driven into Brightwater Valley, Mason felt something colder than weather move through him. The legal envelope on his passenger seat. The 48-hour deadline. His father's house. the Foundation's gentle language. A dog wearing Eli Hart's family name chained in a hidden logging road on the same night Mason came home. Coincidence had never survived long in Mason's line of work. The shepherd suddenly lifted her head, her ears sharpened toward the woods beyond the pine. The puppy stirred under her. Mason followed her gaze, but saw only snow and trees. "What is it?" The dog made a sound so low it was almost swallowed by the wind. Not fear. Warning. Then Mason heard it too, a faint metallic ringing, distant and irregular. Once. Then again. Like a little bell tied to cloth, like something swinging where no wind should have reached it. A mail carrier's bell. Mason had not heard one since childhood, when old Walter Hart used to walk Route 12 with a blue canvas bag at his hip, delivering letters to homes so remote the Postal Service had nearly forgotten them. Walter had been Eli's father, a thin, tall man with white hair, kind eyes, and the stubborn posture of someone who believed every letter deserved a hand to carry it. Mason remembered him only in pieces. A nod from a porch, a gloved hand raising a flag on a mailbox, Eli's voice saying, "My old man thinks an unread letter is just a person nobody listened to." Mason looked down at the shepherd. "Walter," he said quietly, "is that who you're trying to find?" The dog stepped forward, and the chain snapped tight, jerking her wounded neck. Mason moved at once. "Hold still." He pulled a compact cutter from his truck kit and worked at the frozen link where it looped through the padlock. His fingers were stiff, but the old training returned in clean pieces. Assess, stabilize, free the living. The metal resisted. The dog did not move. Penny whimpered beneath her, and the shepherd lowered her head to nudge the pup closer to Mason, as if telling him there was no time for gentleness, only for rescue. The link gave with a hard crack. The chain dropped into the snow. For one strange second, the shepherd remained where she was, as though freedom itself had to be understood, before it could be used. Then her knees buckled. Mason caught her before she fell completely. She was lighter than she should have been. Under the thick coat, her ribs stood out. Around her neck, the fur was worn raw, where the chain had rubbed. "Easy, girl," Mason murmured, and hated how his voice broke on the last word. He lifted Penny first, tucking the puppy inside the open front of his shirt and jacket, against the warmth of his chest. The tiny body shook so hard he could feel it through the fabric. Penny's nose pressed under his chin, searching blindly for heat. Mason had carried wounded men, ammunition, equipment, bodies. He had carried grief so long it had become part of his posture. But this small weight felt different. It asked nothing except not to be left behind. He turned toward the road. "Come on, truck's warm." The shepherd did not follow. She stood on trembling legs, looked at the truck lights through the trees, then turned away from them, toward the deeper woods, toward the faint bell. "No," Mason said. "You're half frozen." She took one step into the snow. Mason followed 2 paces and stopped. "There's a puppy here. You hear me? You did your job." At that, the dog looked back. Snow gathered on her muzzle. Her amber eyes met his with a quiet stubbornness, so human it almost made him angry. Then she did something that reached past all his defenses. She limped back to Mason, pressed her nose gently against the place where Penny trembled inside his jacket, then pushed her muzzle toward the woods again, not leaving the pup, and trusting it. Mason closed his eyes for half a second. He thought of the legal envelope. He thought of the house he planned to abandon. He thought of Thomas Reed, his father, a hard-handed, quiet man who had never known how to ask his son to stay. He thought of Eli Hart, pushing him toward life while choosing death for himself. Mason had spent 12 years believing survival was a debt. Now, in the middle of a northern blizzard, a starving dog wearing Eli's name was asking him to spend that debt on something living. The bell rang again, closer this time. Mason opened his eyes. "All right." The shepherd turned before he finished speaking. as if she had known the answer before he did. She moved slowly, painfully, but with purpose, cutting a narrow path through the snow between the birches. Mason went after her, with Penny tucked against his chest, flashlight in one hand, cutter in the other, the old chain lying behind him like a shed piece of someone else's cruelty. Behind him, the truck engine idled on the road. In front of him, Libby disappeared and reappeared between curtains of falling snow, her dark back a moving shadow, her collar tag catching the light now and then. Hart, R12, blue bag first. Mason Reed had come home to sign away the past, but the past had found him first, chained to a tree, guarding a puppy, and pointing into the storm. And if someone had tried to silence Libby before she could lead him there, then whatever waited in those woods was not merely a lost letter, a missing old man, or a forgotten family name. It was something worth burying, and maybe, God help him, something worth coming home for. Libby did not move like a rescued dog. She moved like a dog with unfinished work. Mason followed her through the narrow cut between the white pines, one hand holding the flashlight low, the other pressed against the small, trembling weight of Penny inside his open jacket. The puppy's breath fluttered against his chest like a weak little bird. Every few steps, Mason expected Libby to collapse. The 6-year-old German Shepherd was soaked, half-starved, raw around the neck, where the chain had chewed at her fur. But she kept moving with a grim steadiness that made Mason think of old handlers and battlefield dogs he had known. Animals trained not to panic when men did. Snow had nearly erased the logging path, yet Libby seemed to remember every bend. She would pause at a buried root, lower her black and tan muzzle, sniff, then choose the left side of a drift instead of the right. Mason watched the ground while she watched the unseen. A dragged mark ran beside the paw prints, long and uneven, as if something heavy had been pulled through the snow and then lifted. Nearby, 2 sets of boot tracks crossed and doubled back. One was wide, deep at the heel. The other was narrower, impatient, leaving sharp toe marks where someone had turned quickly. Mason crouched, brushing snow aside with 2 fingers. These tracks were not old enough to belong to yesterday's storm. They had been made before the wind shifted, before the last hard crust formed over the powder. Hours, maybe, not days. His jaw tightened. A lost dog did not make 2 men hurry through a hidden logging road. A lost dog did not scratch a warning into a collar tag. A lost dog did not lead a man toward the sound of a mail bell in the dark. "What did you see, girl?" Mason murmured. Libby looked back once, amber eyes catching the beam, then continued downhill. The trees opened without warning. Mason stepped out onto the shoulder of an old rural road, half buried under snow and forgotten by plows. A red metal mailbox leaned at an angle beside the road, its flag frozen upright. Beyond it, down in the ditch, sat a mail truck. Not a modern postal vehicle, but an old cream-colored panel truck with faded blue striping. One rear wheel sunk into the snowbank, and the front bumper pressed against a birch sapling. Its driver's door hung open. Snow had blown across the seat. A round brass bell tied near the side mirror swung faintly in the wind, giving that same small, lonely ring Mason had heard through the trees. Libby stopped at the top of the ditch and lowered her head. She did not bark. She did not rush to the door. She stood very still, and that stillness told Mason more than panic would have. This was Walter Hart's truck. Mason knew it before he saw the name painted in weather-worn letters near the back. Hart Rural Delivery. Beneath it, smaller and almost erased by time, was Route 12. Eli had talked about this route during long nights overseas, when men spoke softly, because admitting they missed home made them feel too exposed. His father, Walter Hart, had been a tall, narrow old mailman with white hair that never stayed combed, a weathered face cut by decades of lake wind, and blue eyes that looked gentle until someone suggested a person on a lonely road did not need their mail that badly. Walter had retired years ago, but Eli used to say his father still carried letters to shut-ins, widows, and old soldiers, because government roots ended long before loneliness did. Mason had smiled at that once. Now he stood in the snow with Eli's dog in front of him and did not feel like smiling at anything. He moved down into the ditch and checked the truck the way he had checked abandoned vehicles in places where abandoned vehicles were rarely innocent. Door first, under the frame. Rear compartment. Blind side. No Walter. No body. No fresh pool of blood. But absence did not comfort him. The driver's seat had a dark smear along the edge. Maybe blood. Maybe rust mixed with melting snow. A dent marked the inside of the passenger door, as if someone had kicked it hard from within. The glove box hung open, papers pulled out and scattered. A thermos lay cracked on the floor, coffee frozen in a brown fan around it. The canvas mailbag had been dragged from the back and sliced along one side. Letters spilled across the metal floor, many still bundled with red string. Mason picked one up. Mrs. Alma Whitcomb. Another. Sergeant Paul Brenner. Retired. Another. To the family of James Lyle, with gratitude. The names had the feeling of people the town had learned to speak about in past tense, even while they were still breathing. This was not ordinary mail. Many envelopes were thick, handwritten, and carefully sealed. Some had old military unit numbers in the corner. Some carried the shaky script of aging hands. Mason's throat tightened despite himself. There were stories here. Last words, maybe. Apologies. Promises. Things people waited years to say because pride was easier than tenderness until time ran out. Then he saw his own name. The envelope had slid halfway under the passenger seat, protected from the worst of the snow. Cream paper. Red string. No stamp. Written in a hand he did not recognize, but felt he should. Mason Reed. Not alone. For several seconds, Mason did not move. Penny shifted under his jacket and gave a faint whine, and that tiny sound brought him back before memory could swallow him. He reached for the envelope. Libby, who had limped to the open door, suddenly placed one paw on top of it. Her nails clicked softly against the paper. She did not growl loudly. She gave one low warning from deep in her chest, not directed at Mason's hand, but at the timing of it. Mason stared at her. "You don't want me to open it." Libby's ears twitched. Her eyes moved from the envelope to the red mailbox, standing crooked above the ditch. Mason followed the look, and something in him went cold again. The dog was not guarding the letter from him. She was telling him the order mattered. Blue bag first. The message on her collar. The same idea, repeating like a command, left by someone who feared there would be only one chance to understand it correctly. Mason slid the envelope carefully into the inside pocket of his jacket, close to Penny's warmth. "All right," he said. Mailbox first. The red mailbox resisted when he pulled it open. Ice cracked around the metal lip, loud in the quiet. Inside was not a stack of mail, but 3 objects placed with deliberate care. A small brass key on a loop of blue thread, a torn strip of blue canvas darkened by a brownish stain, and a water-warped postal card sealed in a thin plastic sleeve. Mason took the card out and turned it toward the flashlight. The handwriting was uneven, hurried, but readable. Route 12. Blue bag before red letter. Thomas knew. For a moment the storm seemed to lose sound. Thomas. Not Eli. Not Walter. Thomas Reed. His father. Mason stared at the name as if it had been carved into his own ribs. Thomas Reed had been dead 3 years. A quiet, hard-handed man with a square face Mason had inherited, and a way of loving people so poorly they sometimes mistook it for judgment. Thomas had worked timber, fixed engines, sharpened blades, and lived in the same house Mason was now supposed to sign away. He had not spoken easily. He had not apologized easily. He had certainly never told Mason he was part of any secret mail route tied to the Hart family. Yet here was his name on a card hidden inside an old mailbox in a snowstorm, written like a warning. Libby's nose touched the blue strip in Mason's hand. She gave a faint, distressed sound and looked toward the truck again. Mason held the cloth closer to the light. The stain was not rust. It had dried too dark at the edges. Blood. Not much, but enough. Along one side, the canvas was torn in a jagged line, the way fabric might rip if a dog had seized it in her teeth. Mason looked at Penny inside his jacket, then at Libby's raw neck. Suddenly, he could see a fragment of it. The old man's blue mailbag. Someone grabbing it. Libby biting. The puppy crying. Men panicking because the dog had made noise or torn loose something they needed hidden. They had not killed her because a dead dog would raise questions. They had chained her off the road and trusted the storm to finish what their hands had started. Mason's face hardened. Cruelty dressed as convenience had always disgusted him more than open violence. His phone vibrated once, startlingly loud against his chest. For a second, he thought the sound had come from the envelope. Then he pulled the phone out and saw one bar flicker across the top of the screen. The ridge above the old route must have caught a signal from town. The caller ID read, Sheriff Ruth Bellamy. Mason had not spoken to Ruth in years, but he remembered her. She had been deputy when he was young, a compact woman with strong shoulders, short silver brown, hair usually tucked under a winter hat, and tired brown eyes that missed very little. By now she was 67, old enough that people called her ma'am with respect, but not old in the way fools meant when they wanted someone dismissed. Ruth had a reputation for speaking slowly because she had already decided what mattered and refused to waste breath on the rest. She had known Thomas Reed. She had known Walter Hart. In Brightwater Valley, that meant she probably knew which silences were grief and which were lies. Mason answered. Reed. There was wind on her end, too, and the low murmur of a police radio. Mason, you in town yet? Close. A pause. That means no. I'm on Route 12. The line went quiet in a way that had weight. Mason, Ruth said. Slower now. Why are you on Route 12? He looked at the mail truck in the ditch, the cut-open bag, Libby standing guard despite trembling legs. Because Walter Hart's truck is here. This time, the silence lasted long enough that Mason checked the screen to see if the call had dropped. Ruth came back quieter. Say that again. Walter's truck is in the ditch off the old logging cut. Door open. Mailbag cut. No Walter. On the other end, Ruth swore under her breath, not loudly, not theatrically, but like an old believer disappointed by sin she had expected and hoped not to find. Northern Hearth reported this morning that Walter agreed to be transported to a care facility outside the valley. Mason's grip tightened on the phone. Transported by who? That's what bothered me. No ambulance record came through dispatch. No intake confirmation from the county facility. Just a courtesy notice from Marianne Vale's office saying the family matter had been handled privately. Walter doesn't have family here except... Mason stopped before Eli's name could come out. The dead deserved more care than the living often gave them. Except a son buried at the veterans' cemetery, and a dog he would never leave behind, Ruth finished. Libby's ears lifted at Walter's name. She looked toward the woods beyond the truck, then back at Mason with an urgency that made his chest tighten. Ruth heard something in his silence. Mason, are you alone? He looked down at Penny's small face tucked against his shirt. No. Another pause. Do I want to know? There's a German Shepherd, female, 6 years old maybe, black and tan. Collar says Hart, R12. She was chained to a pine off the road with a puppy under her. Ruth's voice changed, not louder, sharper. Libby. So the dog had a name. Mason looked at her. Libby held his gaze as if the naming had made a vow visible between them. Walter's dog? He asked. Yes. And Walter would sleep in a snowbank himself before he let her freeze. Ruth drew a breath. Mason heard paper rustle, a door close somewhere, the old machinery of law beginning to wake. Listen to me. Don't open anything you find, unless you have to. Don't sign anything from Northern Hearth, and do not hand that dog to anyone who says they have paperwork. Mason's eyes moved to the legal envelope back in his truck, waiting like a trap on the passenger seat. Too late for coincidence, Sheriff. It was too late when they told me an old mailman left town without his dog. Ruth's voice lowered. Mason, if Walter didn't leave by choice, then someone lied to the whole valley before we even knew there was a crime. The little brass bell on the truck rang once more in the wind. Libby stepped past Mason and faced the deeper road, where the snow had begun filling a trail of dragged marks leading away from the ditch. Her body shook. Her paws were bleeding. Still, she did not look toward warmth, safety, or rest. She looked toward whatever had taken Walter Hart. Mason ended the call with Ruth still telling him to wait for backup. He put the phone away, slid the brass key into his pocket, and looked down at the shepherd wearing Eli's family name. I know, he said, though he was not sure whether he was answering Libby, Ruth, his father's ghost, or God. We're not done. Behind him sat the empty mail truck. In his jacket was a letter marked, "Not Alone." In his pocket was a key tied with blue thread, and a card saying his father had known the truth. Ahead, the old Route 12 vanished into snow. Mason Reed had come back to Brightwater Valley to erase, the last line connecting him to home. Now every step into the storm was writing that line again. And somewhere beyond the trees, an old man who had once carried letters for the forgotten might still be waiting for someone to carry him back. Mason Reed brought Libby and Penny to his father's house because it was the only place in Brightwater Valley where he still had a key, and because the storm had turned the roads into white tunnels with no edges. He parked beside the sagging woodpile, killed the engine, and sat for a moment with both hands on the wheel. The old Reed house stood ahead of him beneath a heavy roof of snow, dark except for the porch light he had forgotten was on a timer. It glowed weakly through the storm, not welcoming exactly, but waiting. That was worse. Mason had prepared himself for an empty building. He had not prepared himself for a house that looked as if it still expected him to come home. Penny shifted inside his jacket, warm now but exhausted, her small black and tan head tucked beneath his chin. Libby sat stiffly on the passenger floor, refusing to lie down, her amber eyes fixed on the front door. The 6-year-old German shepherd's black and tan coat was crusted with ice, her neck raw beneath the old brown collar marked Heart. R12. Yet she held herself like a guard, assigned to a post no human had relieved her from. You're stubborn, Mason said. Libby looked at him once. He almost smiled. Yeah, I know. Takes one to know one. The key turned harder than it should have. The door opened on the smell of pine boards, old coffee, cold ash, and time. Mason stepped inside and stopped. So suddenly, Libby bumped the back of his leg. Nothing dramatic waited in the room. No ghost. No voice. Just his father's coat still hanging on the peg beside the door. A dark canvas thing with worn elbows. The radio sat on the shelf by the kitchen, dusty, but exactly where Thomas Reed had always kept it. A single wooden chair faced the front window, angled toward the road, as though the old man had spent his last years watching for someone who never came. Mason did not want that thought. He pushed it away. But the house pushed it back. His father had been a tall, square-faced man with silver hair, pale gray eyes, and hands rough from timber work and engine grease. Thomas had loved poorly, or at least silently. He had fixed broken porch steps, stacked winter wood, changed oil in Mason's first truck, and somehow never learned how to say, I was scared every time you left. Mason laid Penny in a towel-lined basket near the stove and got the fire going. Libby would not move more than 3 feet from the puppy. Even when warmth began to soften the ice in her coat, She stood between the basket and the door, ears shifting toward every sound outside. Mason found a bowl, filled it with water, and watched her sniff it before drinking. Not greedy. Careful. A dog that had learned hunger did not always trust relief. That angered him in a quiet, dangerous way. Dr. Elaine Porter arrived 20 minutes later in a dented Subaru with snow chains and a cracked veterinary decal on the rear window. She was 69, short and solid, with cropped white hair flattened under a knit cap, sharp gray-blue eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and hands that looked gentle only until they had to hold something still. She wore a navy puffer jacket over a gray turtleneck, dark pants tucked into practical winter boots, and carried a battered brown medical bag that seemed older than some of the equipment inside it. Elaine had retired from the clinic 5 years ago, but in a small northern town, retired usually meant only comes out for emergencies, dying animals, and people she likes enough to scold. She stepped inside, took one look at Mason's face, one look at Libby, and said, "You always did bring trouble home bleeding." "I found her chained off Route 12, Mason said. Elaine's expression changed. Not surprise, recognition with worry behind it. "That's Walter Hart's dog." Libby allowed the examination only because Mason sat on the floor beside her, and Penny slept close enough to touch. Elaine worked slowly, speaking to the dog in a low, practical murmur. "Good girl. I see it. I know. You held on longer than you should have had to." She checked Libby's gums, paws, ribs, the raw ring around her neck. Then she examined Penny, warming a stethoscope beneath her palm before touching the puppy's tiny chest. "The pup is cold-stressed, but alive. Dehydrated, hungry? Lucky." Elaine glanced at Libby. "No, not lucky. Protected." Mason did not answer. Elaine lifted the fur along Libby's neck and her mouth tightened. "This chain mark isn't only from tonight." Mason looked at her. "There are fresh abrasions, yes, but beneath them are older pressure lines. Someone restrained her before the pine tree. Days, maybe longer. And she's lost weight recently, not naturally. This dog had a home. Then someone kept her somewhere she did not want to be." Elaine's voice hardened. "They didn't just abandon her in a storm, Mason. They tried to turn a known dog into a stray." Libby suddenly raised her head. Her ears pointed toward the door before the knock came. 3 firm taps. Mason stood. His body did it with old speed, blocking the room before thought caught up. Elaine noticed. She said nothing. On the porch stood Sheriff Ruth Bellamy, and a younger deputy Mason did not know. Ruth was 67, compact and weathered, with a strong square build, tired brown eyes, and short brown hair threaded with silver beneath a winter sheriff's cap. Her brown winter uniform jacket was dusted with snow, badge dull under the porch light, and her face carried the calm of a woman who had seen enough lies to stop being impressed by polished ones. Beside her stood Deputy Luke Bell, 34, lean, clean-shaven except for pale stubble, with short brown hair, hazel eyes, and the anxious posture of a good man still too young to know when procedure had become someone else's weapon. A body cam blinked on his Navy deputy jacket. He held a folder tight against his chest. Ruth entered first. Her eyes went to Libby. "There she is." Libby's tail did not wag, but something in her body softened at Ruth's voice. Luke looked from the dog to Mason, then to the room. "Mr. Reed, we need to clarify some documentation from Northern Hearth." Mason almost laughed. That was quick. Luke opened the folder with care. According to the notice filed this morning, Walter Hart voluntarily transferred custody of the dog to Northern Hearth's animal safety program. The report states the dog had become unstable after Mr. Hart's cognitive decline. Libby gave a low growl. Elaine looked over her glasses. "That dog just kept a puppy alive through a blizzard. If that is instability, I wish more people had it." Ruth's mouth twitched, but she kept her eyes on the folder. "What else?" Luke hesitated. There's also a preliminary intent record involving Thomas Reed's property. Northern Hearth claims Mr. Reed had discussed donating the house for veteran legacy preservation. They say Mason's signature would simply confirm his father's wishes. The room seemed to shrink around Mason. The fire cracked softly behind him. His father's coat hung by the door, like a witness too tired to speak. "That true?" Ruth asked. Mason looked at the legal envelope he had tossed onto the kitchen table. "I don't know." That was the first honest answer the house had pulled out of him. Penny whimpered in her sleep. Libby turned immediately and touched her nose to the puppy's head. The simple tenderness of it made Mason reach into his jacket and pull out the envelope from the mail truck, the one marked Mason Reed, not alone. He had carried it like a live thing since Route 12. Now, with Ruth watching, Elaine silent, and Luke trying not to look too curious, he broke the red string. Inside was one folded sheet. No, half of one. The page had been torn across the bottom, not cleanly, but in a hurried, angry rip. Mason knew the handwriting before his mind named it. Eli Hart had always written slightly slanted, as if the words were leaning forward into whatever came next. Mason read silently at first. "If you are reading this, brother, then I am either late, dead, or too stubborn to say what should have been said sooner. Knowing us, maybe all three. You are alive. Start there. Do not make my death bigger than the life God still put in your hands. If guilt comes easier than gratitude, fight it like you would fight for me. My father promised me he would find you when you became harder to reach than the dead." The sentence ended there. The rest was gone. For a moment, Mason could not feel his hands. The room tilted, not enough for anyone else to see, but enough for him to brace his palm on the table. He heard snow against glass, fire in the stove, Penny breathing. Then another sound came back from 12 years ago. Eli's voice, close to his ear, rough with pain but somehow still calm. "Move, Mason. That's an order." Mason remembered being shoved toward the light between rocks. Remembered looking back. Remembered Eli's grin, impossibly tired, as if he already knew which of them would leave and which would stay. The worst memories were not always the loudest. Sometimes they were the silent ones, the half-second, when a man understood he had been chosen to survive and never agreed to it. Ruth spoke gently. "Mason." He folded the torn letter with too much precision. Someone took the rest. Libby rose. No one told her to. No one moved first. The German Shepherd walked past Mason, past Ruth, past Luke's folder, and went straight to the old wooden cabinet near the back wall. It was Thomas Reed's cabinet, built heavy and ugly, full of tools, spare fuses, fishing line, and the kind of clutter lonely men saved, because throwing anything away felt too much like surrender. Libby sniffed the bottom edge, then began to claw at the floorboards beneath it. "Libby," Elaine warned softly. "Careful." But the dog did not stop. She scratched once, twice, then looked back at Mason with such fierce insistence that the room became still. Luke frowned. "Is she trained for detection?" Mason stared at the cabinet. "No." Ruth's eyes narrowed. "Maybe not by us." Mason moved the cabinet. It resisted, scraping across the floor with a groan that made dust shake from the wall. Behind it, hidden between two old boards, was a narrow seam Mason had never noticed. Not a door. A cutout. He took the brass key from his pocket, the one tied with blue thread from the red mailbox, and tried it in the tiny lock set low near the baseboard. It turned. No one breathed for a second. Inside the wall was a shallow compartment wrapped in oilcloth. Mason pulled the bundle free and set it on the table. Ruth stepped closer. Luke's youthful certainty had drained from his face. Elaine crossed herself once, very small, as if thanking God for dogs who knew where men had hidden their courage. Mason opened the oilcloth. There was a hand-drawn map of Route 12, old but carefully marked. 17 names were written along the route in Thomas Reed's blunt, heavy lettering. Some names had small crosses beside them. Some had dates. Some had notes like delivered, waiting, refused help, no family. The last name at the bottom stopped Mason cold. Thomas Reed. His father had not been outside this story. He had been inside it, at the end of the line. Beneath the map lay a smaller note, written in the same hand. Walter, if he comes home angry, don't give him everything at once. Let him save something first. Then maybe he'll believe he can still be saved, too. Mason read it twice before the words became real. For years he had believed his father's silence meant distance, judgment, disappointment. Now that silence had opened inside a wall and become something else entirely. Fear, love, patience, maybe even faith. A clumsy father's prayer hidden behind a cabinet because he had not known how to hand it to his son while living. Ruth picked up the map carefully and looked at the 17 names. Her face grew older as she read them. I know some of these people, she said. Veterans, widows, shut-ins. Folks Northern Hearth offered to help after their families moved away. Luke swallowed. Sheriff, these documents from the Foundation may still be legal on paper, Ruth said. That does not make them true. Mason looked at Libby. The dog had gone back to Penny, but her amber eyes stayed on him, not soft, not pleading, waiting for him to understand the next step. He did. He was not only looking for Walter Hart anymore. He was not only protecting a dog and a puppy from the storm. He was standing inside his father's last secret, holding half a letter from a dead friend and a map that said Thomas Reed had known far more than Mason had ever allowed himself to ask. Ruth laid the map flat on the table, her finger resting beside Thomas's name. If your father is on Route 12, Mason, she said quietly, then this did not start today. It has been waiting for you for years. Mason looked toward the front window, where snow kept falling over the road he had planned to leave by morning. For the first time since coming home, he was not sure he would be leaving at all. By morning, the storm had softened, but not ended. Snow still fell over the Reed house in slow white sheets, turning the porch rails, the woodpile, and Mason Reed's old dark pickup into blurred shapes beneath the pale winter light. Inside, the house felt different from the night before. Not warmer exactly, though the stove had been burning for hours. It felt awake. The map of Route 12 lay on the kitchen table beneath Sheriff Ruth Bellamy's gloved hand. The torn letter from Eli Hart rested beside it. Penny slept in the towel-lined basket near the stove, her tiny black and tan body rising and falling in shallow but steadier breaths. Libby stood over her like a weary sentry, the 6-year-old German shepherd's black saddle still damp in places, her amber eyes sharp despite exhaustion, the old brown collar around her raw neck carrying the metal tag that had started everything. Hart, 1-2. Mason had not slept. He still wore his green military-style camouflage shirt with the sleeves rolled near his elbows, matching tactical cargo pants, and dark brown field boots tracked with melted snow. His square, weathered face looked harder in the gray morning, salt and pepper stubble dark against his jaw, pale gray eyes fixed on the map as though he could force it to confess. He had come home to sign paper. Instead, he had found a dog chained in a storm, a missing mailman, half a letter from a dead friend, and his father's name hidden inside a wall. Deputy Luke Bell stood near the sink with his folder open, reading the Northern Hearth documents for the 3rd time. The young deputy's clean-cut face looked less certain than it had the night before. His body cam blinked faintly against his navy jacket. "Sheriff," he said, careful with his words. "The paperwork still says the Foundation had preliminary authorization. It doesn't prove they did anything wrong." Ruth did not look up. "Paperwork proves what someone wanted recorded." Dr. Elaine Porter still sitting by the stove with her medical bag open, gave a dry little sound. The retired veterinarian had cleaned Libby's neck and wrapped it with a soft white bandage. Her cropped white hair stuck out from beneath her cap, and her sharp, gray-blue eyes moved between the humans with the same frank disappointment she usually reserved for people who waited too long to bring in an injured animal. And a wound proves what someone hoped would stay covered. Mason said nothing. His thumb rested on the torn edge of Eli's letter. My father promised me he would find you when you became harder to reach than the dead. The line had been living under his ribs all night. He had spent 12 years believing Eli's death was a debt. Now the dead man's father had apparently been trying to find him, and Mason's own father had known. A vehicle came up the drive. Libby heard it first. Her head lifted, her ears locked forward. No bark, no growl yet, just a stillness that made everyone else turn. Through the frosted front window, headlights swept across the porch. A black SUV rolled to a stop in the snow, clean in a way no vehicle should have been clean after a night like that. Its tires barely spun. Its engine quieted. Then the driver's door opened, and Marianne Vale stepped out, as if the weather had arranged itself around her. She was 63, tall and slim, wrapped in a long ivory wool coat that reached below her knees. The coat was too elegant for the road, too bright for the storm, and somehow untouched by the slush around her polished black boots. Her ash-blonde hair, cut into a smooth bob, framed a face carefully kept by money and discipline. Her skin was pale, her mouth soft, her blue eyes clear and cold beneath an expression of practiced sympathy. She wore black leather gloves and carried a dark brown leather case in one hand, while in the other she held a small insulated tray with paper cups of tea. Behind her came a younger man in a charcoal overcoat. Grant Pell, the Foundation's attorney, 39, narrow-shouldered, clean-shaven, with sandy hair combed too neatly, and nervous eyes that kept checking Marianne before he spoke, as if his courage had to be approved in advance. Marianne knocked only once before Ruth opened the door. "Sheriff Bellamy," Marianne said warmly, "thank God you're here. We were worried this might become more difficult than it needed to be." Ruth's face did not change. "Most things get difficult when people go missing." Marianne lowered her eyes for a second. Not quite enough to be grief, and not quite little enough to be arrogance. "Walter Hart has not gone missing. He has been confused. There's a difference, and it matters when we're trying to protect an elderly man from his own fear." Mason stood behind Ruth. Marianne's gaze moved to him with immediate recognition. Her smile deepened, softened, adjusted itself for a veteran. "Mr. Reed," she said. "I'm Marianne Vale. I wish our first meeting were under kinder circumstances. Your father spoke of you with great pride." That should not have landed. It did. Mason hated that it did. Marianne entered with permission Ruth did not quite give, and placed the tea on the kitchen counter, like a woman arriving to comfort mourners. Grant Pell followed, clutching a folder stamped with Northern Hearth Veterans Foundation. Marianne's eyes went to the table. The map, the torn letter, the red string. Then to Libby. Only for half a second did something sharp pass across her face. Then it vanished beneath concern. "Oh, Libby," she said softly. Poor girl. Libby stepped in front of Penny. Marianne noticed. Everyone noticed. "That dog belongs to Walter Hart," Mason said. "She was under Walter's care," Marianne replied gently, as if correcting a child without humiliating him. "But Walter's condition has been declining. Our foundation has assisted him for months. There were safety concerns." Elaine stood. I examined her. This dog was restrained before she was chained to that pine. Grant opened his folder. "Dr. Porter, with respect, your medical observation doesn't establish legal custody." Elaine looked at him over her glasses. "No, it establishes cruelty." The room went still. Marianne did not flinch. That was the first thing about her that truly frightened Mason. Most guilty people reacted to accusation. Mary Ann absorbed it, softened it, and returned it as concern. "I understand emotions are high," she said. "A storm, a wounded animal, Mr. Reed returning to his father's home. And of course, the Hart name must be painful for him." Her eyes came back to Mason. "Combat grief can make symbols feel like messages." Mason took one step forward. "That dog led me to Walter's truck. And thank God you found it," Mary Ann said. "But an old truck in a ditch does not prove a crime. Walter often drove routes he should not have driven. He was proud, stubborn. Sometimes pride becomes danger." Ruth tapped the folder in Luke's hand. "Your office reported Walter was transported to a care facility." "Yes," Mary Ann said. "Private transport was arranged." "Name a facility?" "Sheriff, I'm happy to provide all documents through proper channels." That was not the question. The air tightened. Luke looked from Ruth to Mary Ann, then down at the papers. He wanted the documents to make sense. Mason could see it. Luke was young enough to believe the clean version first, and decent enough to be troubled when dirt showed through. Mary Ann turned to him, not Ruth. "Deputy Bell, you've seen the records. Walter signed consent for protective assistance. Thomas Reed also expressed a desire for this property to become part of a veteran legacy project. Northern Hearth isn't taking anything. We are preserving what these men cared about." Mason's hand curled at his side. "My father never told me that." "With respect," Mary Ann said, voice softening further. "Did you give him many chances?" The question cut clean and deep. Mason did not move, but something in his face must have changed, because Libby's ears flattened. There it was. Mary Ann had not raised her voice, had not threatened him, had not lied loudly enough to attack. She had simply placed her finger on the exact bruise between Mason and his father, and pressed. Penny woke and made a tiny sound. Libby turned to nuzzle the puppy, then froze. Her nose lifted toward Mary Ann's leather case. Slowly, stiffly, the German Shepherd moved away from the basket and stood in front of the case, head low. A growl gathered in her chest, not loud, certain. Mary Ann smiled sadly. "You see, this is why we were concerned." But Penny, still wobbly and half-wrapped in the towel, crawled out of the basket before Elaine could stop her. The puppy stumbled across the floor with the foolish determination of new life, reached Mary Ann's case, and bit the lower edge of the leather strap. Grant bent to pull her away, but Penny tugged once, sharp and clumsy. The case shifted. Its latch had not been fully closed. A torn piece of red envelope slid onto the floor. No one spoke. Mason bent and picked it up. The paper was thick, old, and torn along one side. On it was Eli Hart's handwriting. If they use my death to buy his silence, that was all. The rest was gone. For the first time, Mary Ann's mask slipped. It was not fear exactly. It was calculation interrupted. Her blue eyes flashed toward the paper, then toward Grant, then back to Mason. Half a second. Less. But Mason had survived too long by seeing what people tried to hide between heartbeats. Then Mary Ann smiled again. "That is private Hart family material," she said. "Walter removed several sensitive documents from our archive after his confusion worsened." "Archive?" Ruth asked. "Northern Hearth has been helping organize Walter's estate and veteran correspondence. With permission." "From Walter?" "From appropriate parties." "Meaning not Walter," Ruth said. Grant cleared his throat. "Sheriff, we should be careful about accusations. The Foundation has legal relationships with multiple families in this valley." Libby growled again. Mason looked from the red scrap to Mary Ann's gloved hands. On the right glove, near the thumb, was a faint smear of red ink. Caught in the small brass clasp of her case was a thread of blue canvas, the same blue as the torn strip from the mailbox. Something hot rose inside him. It came fast and familiar. the old combat self stepping forward before the man had voted. Mason moved toward Marianne. Grant backed up. Luke's hand twitched near his belt. Ruth said his name, low and warning. But Libby reached him first. She caught Mason's sleeve gently between her teeth. Not hard. Not enough to tear. Just enough. Mason stopped. The dog did not look frightened of him. That made it worse. She trusted him not to become the thing he hated. She held his sleeve, amber eyes steady, asking him to see before he struck, to listen before he burned the truth down with his anger. For a breath, the kitchen was silent except for the stove, and Penny's small sniffle near Elaine's boots. Mason released his fist. Marianne watched the exchange with interest, and Mason realized she had wanted him to lose control. If he had grabbed her, shouted, threatened, anything, she would have had the story she needed. Damaged Navy SEAL, unstable, triggered by grief, interfering with a charitable foundation. He stepped back. Ruth saw it too. Her mouth tightened. "Ms. Vale," Ruth said, "I'll need copies of every transport record, custody form, and property document you referenced." "Of course." Marianne's smile returned to its polished shape. "I want only what is best for everyone involved." "For Walter?" Mason asked. "For Walter, for your father's legacy, and for you." She looked at the red scrap still in his hand. "Mr. Reed, grief can make old guilt sound like truth. Your father wanted peace. Don't confuse his silence with betrayal." Then she leaned slightly closer, her voice low enough that it felt meant only for him, though everyone could hear it. "Don't confuse old guilt with truth." She left before Ruth had legal cause to stop her. Grant followed quickly, nearly slipping on the porch step. The black SUV reversed through the snow and vanished down the white driveway as cleanly as it had arrived. Mason stood in the kitchen holding the torn red paper. Libby released his sleeve and leaned against his leg, suddenly exhausted. Penny crawled back into the basket. Elaine whispered something under her breath that sounded like a prayer and a curse braided together. Luke stared at the place Marianne had stood. She knew exactly what to say to him. Ruth looked at Mason, then at the torn letter, then at the blue thread caught in Mason's memory from the case clasp. "Yes," she said, "and that means she came here for more than a house." Mason looked toward his father's coat by the door. For the first time, the old silence inside the room no longer felt empty. It felt threatened. Marianne Vale did not merely want the Reed house. She knew the wound Mason carried, knew how to dress a blade as kindness, and knew exactly which pain might make him sign away the truth with his own hand. Libby did not lead Mason Reed to the Northern Hearth office. She did not pull toward the clean streets of Brightwater or the polished black SUV tracks Marianne Vale had left behind. The moment Marianne was gone, Libby rose from beside Penny's basket, limped to the front door, and stood there with her head lowered, staring through the glass as if something outside had called her by name. Dr. Elaine Porter said the dog needed rest. Sheriff Ruth Bellamy said backup was on the way. Deputy Luke Bell said they should wait until the snowplows cleared the lake road. Mason heard all of them, and still he knew from the set of Libby's ears that waiting was the one thing they could not afford. Penny was too weak to travel, so Elaine stayed behind with the puppy, the fire, and the torn red scrap locked in an evidence sleeve. Ruth drove her sheriff's SUV. Luke followed in his cruiser. Mason sat in the back seat with Libby across his boots, wrapped in an old wool blanket from Thomas Reed's closet. The 6-year-old German shepherd should have slept, but every few minutes she lifted her black and tan head and pushed her nose toward the frosted window, guiding them not by road signs, but by memory. Left at the frozen culvert. Slow near the birch grove. Stop where the lake wind cut across the road. She was not searching anymore. She was remembering. The lake road curved beneath a ceiling of white branches. Brightwater Lake lay beyond the trees, frozen under a skin of blue-gray ice, its surface blurred by blowing snow. Mason had known this road as a boy, though he had not driven it in more than 20 years. His father used to take him along it in silence, one hand on the wheel, thermos between the seats, sawdust still clinging to his cuffs. Back then, Mason thought silence meant emptiness. Now he was beginning to fear it had been full of things Thomas Reed had not known how to say. Libby suddenly pressed both paws against the door and gave a low, urgent whine. Ruth slowed the SUV. Ahead, half hidden by spruce and snowdrift, stood the old wooden church of St. Agnes. It had been abandoned for years. The steeple leaned slightly toward the lake, the cross on top dark against the white sky. Paint peeled from the clapboard walls. One stained glass window had been boarded over, and the front steps were buried almost to the rail. Yet the small building did not look dead. It looked like a tired old woman with her hands folded, still praying after everyone else had gone home. Ruth parked near the cemetery fence. Route 12 used to pass here, she said. Mail carriers rested in the basement during storms. Luke frowned. How does the dog know that? Mason opened the door, and Libby pushed out before he could stop her. She stumbled once, caught herself, then walked straight toward the side entrance where the snow had been disturbed by a dragging body and one bare handprint frozen near the threshold. Mason's chest tightened. Because Walter knew it first. The side door was not locked. It hung half-closed, the old latch splintered. Inside, the church smelled of dust, cold wood, and old hymnals. Rows of pews sat beneath sheets of gray light. A cracked pulpit leaned at the front. Someone had recently crossed the aisle. Snow had melted and refrozen in dark patches on the warped floor. Libby did not pause in the sanctuary. She went to a narrow door behind the pulpit and pushed it with her nose. The stairs beyond descended into blackness. Mason took point before Ruth could object. Flashlight up, body angled, boots careful on the icy steps. He had entered buildings like this in war zones, where every shadow could become a muzzle flash. But the danger here felt older and meaner. Not sudden violence, quiet disposal. At the bottom, his flashlight found shelves, coal buckets, broken folding chairs, and then a pair of boots. Walter Hart lay curled against the far wall beside an old furnace, wrapped in a mail carrier's blue canvas bag, as if it were a blanket. He was 82, tall, even folded by weakness, with a narrow frame, white hair plastered to his forehead, a deeply lined face, and pale blue eyes sunk into fever, but still stubbornly awake. One hand was bandaged with a strip torn from his own shirt. The other clutched the blue mail bag so tightly, his knuckles looked carved from wax. His old navy postal coat was ripped at the sleeve, and a red scarf had frozen stiff where it touched the floor. Libby gave a sound Mason had never heard from her before. Not bark, not whine, but something like grief finding breath. She pushed past him and pressed her muzzle to Walter's cheek. The old man's eyes opened. For a second, he did not see Mason. He saw the dog, his shaking hand move to her head. "Good girl," he whispered. "Good. Good girl." Then his eyes shifted upward and found Mason's face. Walter stared, as if looking not at the man in front of him, but at another man standing behind him, younger, smiling, dead. "She found you," he said. The words went through Mason harder than accusation. Ruth knelt beside Walter, checking his pulse with a gentleness that did not slow her authority. "Walter, we're getting you out of here." "No hospital before the bag," Walter rasped. "Hospital first," Ruth said. Walter's grip tightened. "Blue bag first. That's what I told her. That's what I told Libby. If Mason came, blue bag first." Mason crouched, his pale gray eyes locked on the old man. "Who did this?" Walter swallowed with difficulty. "Men on the road. One from the Foundation. One I didn't know. They wanted the red letter. I'd already moved it." His breath hitched. Libby bit the bag. Penny cried. They panicked. I ran when the truck slid. Made it here because the Lord gives old fools one more mile when the promise matters. Luke looked shaken. Mr. Hart, Northern Hearth reported you voluntarily entered care. Walter almost smiled. It was thin and bitter. They've been trying to put me somewhere quiet for months. Ruth radioed for medical transport, but the storm had slowed everyone. They had minutes, maybe more, before help reached the lake road. Walter insisted on sitting upright. Mason helped him, and the old man's weight felt fragile in a way Mason hated. He had seen strong men reduced by cold, blood loss, time. But Walter's weakness carried no surrender. He still held the bag like a soldier holding a flag. Footsteps sounded above. Luke turned fast, hand near his weapon, but Ruth called, "It's Mabel." A small, elderly woman appeared at the basement stairs, breathing hard from the cold. Mabel Crane was 74, short and slightly bent, with silver hair pinned in a low bun beneath a purple knit hat, soft, wrinkled brown skin, and bright eyes that missed nothing despite the thickness of her glasses. She wore an old blue postal coat over a gray wool dress, red scarf tucked at her throat, and snow boots that looked too heavy for her narrow legs. A tiny pin shaped like an envelope gleamed on her lapel. Mabel had worked with Walter at the post office for 30 years, and she carried the air of a woman people underestimated until they lied in front of her. Ruth had called her because St. Agnes had once been a Route 12 shelter, and Mabel still had the old church key. She took one look at Walter and pressed a gloved hand to her mouth. "Oh, Walt." Walter tried to lift the bag. "Tell them." Mabel came closer, tears standing in her eyes but her voice steady. Route 12 wasn't just mail, not after the county cut service. Walter kept going for the shut-ins, the veterans, the widows whose children moved south and stopped writing. Then Thomas Reed started sending letters through him too. Mason looked at her. "My father?" Mabel nodded. "Your father wrote more than he mailed. He'd bring envelopes to the back counter, stand there like a man facing a firing squad, then take half of them home again. Walter kept the ones Thomas told him to keep. He said, 'Someday Mason may come home angry. Don't hand him my words until he remembers how to protect something gentle.'" Mason looked away. The basement blurred at the edges. Then Libby did something strange. She left Walter's side and walked to a row of old wooden mail slots built into the basement wall. Many were broken. Some still had names written in fading ink. She pressed her nose to one low slot and scratched once. Mason shone his flashlight over it. The name above the slot wasn't Hart. It was Reed. Inside lay a tiny folded church bulletin, yellowed with age. Mason opened it carefully. Written across the blank back in Thomas Reed's heavy hand was a sentence that felt less like a note than a prayer. "If he comes with the dog, he's ready to hear the rest." No one spoke. Even Luke stopped shifting. The little basement, with its dust and frozen stone walls, seemed suddenly less abandoned. It felt as if the old church had been holding its breath for years, waiting for a son, a dog, and one last act of mercy to arrive in the same storm. Walter opened the blue bag at last. Inside were bundled letters, a list of names, several property records, and an old handheld tape recorder wrapped in cloth. Mason recognized his father's handwriting on 3 envelopes. Thomas Reed had addressed them all to him, but never sent them. One said, "For when anger gets tired." Another said, "For when you stop running." The third had only his name. Walter's hand trembled over the bundles. Northern Hearth found out we were warning people before they signed. Marianne Vale used soft words. Said she was protecting old veterans from being exploited by their own confusion. Then she took their homes one signature at a time. His eyes hardened despite the fever. Thomas knew. He refused. He recorded what she said when she thought no one would believe an old timberman over a saint in a cream coat. Ruth took the property records and scanned the names. "These are transfer agreements." "Drafts," Mabel said. "Some became real. Some Walter stopped. Some families still don't know how close they came." Mason looked into the bag. "Where is the red letter?" Walter closed his eyes. The answer was in his silence before he gave it. "Gone," he whispered. "They took the piece they could use, not the truth, but enough to twist it." Mason felt the torn red scrap in memory. If they use my death to buy his silence, what is the red letter? He asked. Walter reached into the bottom of the bag with shaking fingers and pulled out a faded photograph. He handed it to Mason. The picture showed 3 men in front of the Reed house years ago. Thomas Reed stood on one side, stern and broad, one hand resting on a porch post. Eli Hart stood on the other, younger, warm-eyed, wearing that crooked grin Mason had tried and failed to forget. Between them stood Mason himself, not yet broken, not yet gray at the temples, one arm slung around Eli's shoulder. All 3 men looked as if they belonged to a world that had not started taking them apart. Mason turned the photo over. On the back, in Walter's careful hand, were the words, "The red letter is not for Mason. It is about Mason." The basement seemed to go colder. Mason stared at the sentence until the letters became wounds. If the red letter was not addressed to him, then Eli had written it to someone else. To Thomas, maybe. To Walter. And whatever it said, Marianne Vale had feared it enough to tear it apart, hide it, and use only the pieces that could hurt him. Walter's voice came very softly. "It was never meant to accuse you, son." Mason could not answer. Libby leaned against his leg, exhausted, but steady, her bandaged neck brushing his knee. Above them, the church bell, long cracked and half-frozen, moved once in the wind. It gave no full ring, only a faint, broken tone. But in that broken sound, Mason heard something he had not expected to hear in Brightwater Valley. Not judgment, a summons. By late afternoon, the snow had stopped falling, and Brightwater Valley looked clean enough to fool a stranger. White roofs shone beneath a pale winter sky. The frozen lake held a strip of blue light, like glass under prayer. Smoke rose from chimneys and gentle gray columns, and the roads around the community center had been plowed just wide enough for cars, church vans, and county trucks to gather beneath the banner Marianne Vale had ordered, hung across the front entrance. Honoring forgotten veterans. Mason Reed stood across the street for a moment before going in, one hand resting on the old blue mailbag Walter Hart had refused to let anyone else carry. The words on the banner should have meant something good. They should have meant warmth, memory, respect. But Mason had learned overnight that the most dangerous lies did not always come wearing cruelty. Sometimes they came wrapped in cream wool, printed on good paper, and spoken in a voice soft enough to make decent people lower their guard. Beside him, Libby stood with her bandaged neck lifted, black and tan coat brushed, but still rough from the storm, amber eyes fixed on the glass doors. Penny rode in Dr. Elaine Porter's arms, wrapped in a small gray blanket, the puppy's head poking out just enough to watch the world with sleepy brown eyes. Walter sat in Ruth Bellamy's sheriff's SUV behind them, weak but upright, a hospital blanket around his shoulders and his old red scarf at his throat. Mabel Crane sat beside him, one small gloved hand on the tape recorder wrapped in cloth, as if she feared the truth might grow legs and run before anyone heard it. "Still time to wait for the state investigator," Deputy Luke Bell said quietly. The young deputy looked pale under his winter cap. His navy jacket was zipped high, body cam blinking on his chest, one hand gripping a folder full of copies Ruth had made at the station. The certainty he'd carried the day before had thinned into something better. Unease, with a conscience beneath it. Mason looked through the windows. Inside, the room was full. Elderly men in faded service caps, widows in wool coats, volunteers pouring coffee, a local reporter with a camera near the back. Marianne had chosen her battlefield well. "No," Mason said. "She built this room to make me sign. If we wait, she gets to tell the story first." Ruth stepped beside him. At 67, she looked almost small against the snowbank, but there was nothing small about the way she carried authority. "Then we don't shout," she said. "We let her talk. We let her hang her own words where everyone can see them." Libby pressed her shoulder against Mason's leg, not leaning from weakness this time, anchoring him. Inside, Marianne Vale was already at the microphone. Her long ivory coat had been replaced by a tailored cream dress and a pale wool wrap that made her look less like a businesswoman and more like a grieving daughter of the whole town. Her ash-blonde bob was smooth, her blue eyes moist under the lights, her black gloves folded neatly on the podium. Behind her stood Grant Pell, narrow and anxious in a charcoal suit, clutching legal papers against his chest. Marianne's smile changed when Mason entered. Did not break. It adjusted. "And here he is," she said warmly, as if she had invited him, and he had arrived exactly on cue. "Mason Reed, a son of Brightwater, a Navy SEAL, a man who has carried more than most of us can imagine." People turned. The room softened toward him before he said a word. That was her skill. She did not accuse him. She embraced him in public until any refusal would look like ingratitude. Mason felt every eye. He had been watched by enemies before. He had been watched by men waiting for orders, by wounded soldiers waiting for evacuation, by families at funerals trying to understand why his boots had come home, and Eli Hart's had not. But being pitied by his hometown was worse in a quieter way. It reached the boy who had once wanted Thomas Reed to look proud of him, then hated himself for wanting it. Marianne continued. Thomas Reed loved this valley. He loved its veterans, its widows, its lonely men who came home from war and never fully returned from it. Her voice trembled at the perfect places. Before his passing, Thomas expressed a desire that his home not become another empty house, but a living memorial, a place of service, a place of healing. A few people nodded. Mason saw Mrs. Alma Whitcomb in the front row, a tiny white-haired widow in a blue coat, pressing a tissue to her mouth. Beside her, Sergeant Paul Brenner, retired, thin and stooped under a faded army cap, lowered his eyes, as if already moved by the idea of one more place where forgotten soldiers might be remembered. Then Marianne lifted a document. With Mason's blessing today, Northern Hearth will begin that work. There it was. Not a request. A public altar. Grant brought the paper to Mason. Ruth did not stop him. Luke watched. Walter remained by the wall, breathing hard, Mabel close beside him. Mason took the document and looked at the signature line where Thomas Reed's name had been copied in dark ink. For several seconds, the room held its breath. Mason had seen his father sign checks, repair orders, school forms, tax papers. Before 2009, Thomas's signature had been square and heavy, like the man. But after the saw accident that damaged his right hand, Thomas had learned to sign left-handed. The letters leaned slightly left. The final stroke always trembled downward. This signature leaned right. Clean. Confident. Wrong. Mason lifted his eyes. My father never signed like that after 2009. The room changed, not loudly, just enough. A rustle. A cough that stopped halfway. A volunteer lowered the coffee pot without pouring. Marianne's smile stayed in place, but her eyes cooled. Grief can sharpen memory in strange ways, Mr. Reed, and sometimes it can distort it. An old man near the aisle shifted in his chair. He was Harold Finch, 81, a retired mechanic with a narrow face, tobacco-stained mustache, and hands twisted by arthritis. He had worked with Thomas Reed after the accident. Tom couldn't hold a pen right-handed after that saw took him, Harold muttered, not quite loud enough for the whole room, but loud enough for doubt to begin moving. Marianne heard it. Mason saw her calculate again. "Of course," she said gently. "We welcome any review. But today is not a trial. Today is about legacy." Libby moved. She had been standing beside Mason, silent, watchful, but now she walked down the center aisle toward Walter. People drew back instinctively. No one screamed. Something about the dog's slow, wounded dignity made the room part with respect. Penny stirred in Elaine's arms and gave one small sound. Libby stopped at Walter's feet. The old mailman looked down, confused and fever-weary. His walking cane leaned against his chair, a plain wooden cane with a worn rubber tip and a brass band near the handle. Libby placed one paw on the cane. Walter frowned. "What is it, girl?" Penny suddenly wriggled in Elaine's blanket. Elaine tried to hold her, but the puppy slipped down, padded clumsily across the floor, and seized the rubber tip of the cane in her tiny teeth. A few people laughed softly despite the tension. Then the rubber cap came loose. A narrow metal tube slid out and clinked onto the floor. Walter went white. Mabel covered her mouth. "Walt?" "I forgot," Walter whispered. "Lord, forgive me, I forgot." Ruth picked up the tube, opened it, and drew out a small strip of magnetic tape wound inside a protective sleeve. The tape recorder from the blue bag sat on the table near the podium. Mabel's hands shook as she loaded the strip into place. Marianne stepped forward. "Sheriff, I must object to playing unverified material in a public setting." Ruth looked at her, then object quietly. The room went still. Mabel pressed play. Static filled the speakers first. Then came the voice of Thomas Reed. Older, rough, tired, but unmistakable. "Walter, if Mason ever comes home, don't let him sign because he thinks I wanted him gone. I never wanted my son gone. I was just too proud, too scared, and too late to say it right." Mason felt the floor drop out beneath him. Thomas's voice continued, strained by age and breath. "The Vale woman came again today. Said she could make my house useful. Said Mason would never come back anyway. Said a man like me shouldn't leave property tangled up with a son who had already buried himself somewhere else." A murmur spread through the hall. Marianne's face lost color, but only for a heartbeat. The tape crackled. Thomas said, "If she brings papers with my name, Walter, remember what I told you. After the accident, I can't sign like I used to. And if Mason hears this, tell him." The sound snapped into silence. Mabel stared at the recorder. It stopped. Ruth checked the tape. "There's more, but the strip is damaged." Grant stepped forward quickly. "This is exactly why such material should not be presented. It is incomplete, emotionally charged, and potentially manipulated." Marianne recovered her voice. "I am deeply sorry," she said, turning toward the room, as though she were the wounded party. Thomas was a dear man in pain. Pain can make people suspicious. We have all seen how loneliness changes our elders. Walter tried to stand. "You left me in the road." Marianne looked at him with sorrow so convincing it made Mason sick. "Walter, you were confused. You still are." That nearly did it. Mason stepped forward, the old fury rising fast, clean, useful. He could cross the distance in 2 strides. He could break the calm off Grant's face, tear the papers from Marianne's hands, force the truth into the open the brutal way. His fists remembered faster than his heart did. But Libby stood between him and the stage, not facing Marianne, facing Mason. Her amber eyes held his. Her bandaged neck trembled. She had crossed a storm, guarded a puppy, found Walter, found the hidden place behind Thomas's wall, and now she was doing the hardest thing of all. She was asking Mason not to become the weapon Marianne needed him to be. Mason stopped. He breathed once, twice. Then he turned to the room instead of the woman. "My father did not sign that document," he said. His voice was low, but it carried. Walter Hart did not leave his dog. Eli Hart's letter was torn apart. And Northern Hearth has been using words like care and legacy to make old people doubt their own memories. The room did not erupt. Truth rarely arrives as thunder. Sometimes it arrives as people looking at one another and realizing they have each been afraid alone. Marianne stepped away from the podium. "Grant, we're leaving." Ruth moved toward her. "Not yet." "You have no warrant." "No. But I have a room full of witnesses, an injured old man, a forged signature concern, an animal cruelty report, and enough reasonable suspicion to keep asking questions." Marianne's smile finally thinned. "Be careful, Sheriff. Public embarrassment is not evidence." She turned toward the side exit. Libby moved before anyone else. The German Shepherd crossed the aisle and planted herself in front of the door. Silent, still, her black and tan body squared despite exhaustion. She did not lunge. She did not bark. She only watched Marianne with the calm certainty of an animal that had smelled fear under perfume. Marianne stopped. For the first time all day, she had no beautiful sentence ready. And Mason knew then that the rest of Thomas Reed's tape would not only save a house, it would bring down the woman who had built her kindness out of other people's silence. Libby stood in front of the side exit like a judgment no one had trained her to become. She did not bark at Marianne Vale. She did not bare her teeth. She simply held her ground, black and tan body squared despite the bandage around her neck, amber eyes fixed on the woman who had spent years teaching Brightwater Valley to mistake control for compassion. Marianne's hand rested on the door handle. For the first time since Mason Reed had met her, her beautiful face had no ready expression. The room behind her had gone silent except for the low hum of the community center lights and the faint hiss of the old tape recorder on the table. Sheriff Ruth Bellamy stepped forward, one hand raised, not toward her weapon, but toward the people in the room. "Nobody moves," she said calmly. At 67, with snow still melting on the shoulders of her brown sheriff's jacket, Ruth looked like every hard winter this town had survived. "Mabel, can you get the rest of that tape?" Mabel Crane, the 74-year-old former postal clerk with silver hair tucked under a purple knit hat and a small envelope pin on her faded blue coat, bent over the recorder with careful, trembling hands. "The strip is folded, not broken clean through," she said. "If we pass the damaged part by hand, it may play." Grant Pell, Marianne's narrow-shouldered attorney, stepped forward. "This is irregular, Sheriff." Ruth did not look at him. "So is an old man being found half frozen under a church, while your client reports him safely transported." Mabel turned the tiny reel with a pencil, inch by inch, as if she were feeding a fragile truth back into the world. The room waited. Mason stood near the front with Walter Hart seated beside him, the old mailman wrapped in a blanket, pale but upright. Walter's long, narrow face had the gray exhaustion of a man who had outrun death by stubbornness and prayer. His blue eyes stayed on the recorder. Mason's own hands were still. That took effort. His broad shoulders, his weathered square face, the salt and pepper stubble along his jaw, the pale gray eyes that had seen too much. All of it made him look like a man built to break doors. But Libby had reminded him that some doors had to be opened, not shattered. The tape caught. Static rose first. Then Thomas Reed's voice returned, rough and low, carrying the weight of age and regret. "Walter, I'm recording this because I don't trust paper anymore." Marianne Vale came by again. Said she could honor Eli Hart. Said she could protect Walter. Said if I loved veterans, I'd sign before Mason came back and ruined it with old anger. The room stirred. Marianne's face hardened, but she said nothing. Thomas's voice continued. She talked like Mercy, but she looked at this house like it was already hers. I told her no. I told her my son may have run from home, but I would not give away the place he might need if he ever stopped running. Mason lowered his head. The words struck deeper than accusation ever could have. His father had not wanted him gone. His father had been guarding a door Mason himself refused to open. On the tape, Thomas coughed. "If documents appear after I'm dead, check the hand. After the saw accident, I sign left. If it leans right, it's not mine. And if Mason hears this, tell him I was proud before I knew how to be kind. That was my sin, not his." The silence afterward was not empty. It was full of people understanding too late. Then Luke Bell stepped forward. The 34-year-old deputy's young face was pale, his hazel eyes troubled, but clear. "Sheriff," he said, "my body cam recorded Ms. Vale yesterday saying Libby was under Foundation custody. It also recorded her refusing to name the facility Walter was supposedly taken to." He swallowed. "And it recorded that red envelope scrap falling from her case before she claimed it was Foundation archive material." Grant looked at Marianne. Marianne did not look back. Ruth nodded once. "Good. Preserve it." Dr. Elaine Porter, still holding Penny in the gray blanket, lifted her chin. The retired veterinarian's short white hair framed her stern face, and her wire-rimmed glasses caught the overhead light. "I'll sign the animal cruelty report tonight. Libby's injuries are consistent with restraint before the storm. Not a stray, not an accident." Mabel raised one shaking hand. "And I'll testify that Thomas Reed never signed. Over that house. He asked Walter to hold his letters. He wanted Mason to receive them when he could bear them." The room began to change, not with shouting, with old people finding their feet. Mrs. Alma Whitcomb, the tiny white-haired widow in the blue coat, stood first. Her hands trembled around her purse. "Northern Hearth came to me after my Harold died," she said. "They said my house was too much for me. Said signing would protect me from greedy relatives I don't even have." Beside her, Sergeant Paul Brenner, retired, thin beneath his faded army cap, rose slowly with the help of a cane. "Walter brought me a letter last month," he said. "Told me not to sign until my daughter read every page." The Foundation had buried a sale clause in the care agreement. A third voice came from the back, then another. A widow. A retired machinist. A former nurse whose brother's property had been preserved and then sold. One by one, the forgotten began remembering out loud. Marianne tried to speak over them. These are vulnerable people being frightened by incomplete information. Walter stood then. He should not have. His knees shook. Mason reached to steady him, but Walter held up one hand. The old mailman looked small beneath the lights, his red scarf loose around his throat, his blue postal coat torn from the storm. Yet the room quieted for him. "Vulnerable doesn't mean voiceless," Walter said. "Old doesn't mean empty. And lonely doesn't mean available." Something broke in the room then, not chaos. A spell. Marianne turned toward the side exit again. Libby did not move. Ruth stepped between them. "Marianne Vale, you're being detained pending investigation for suspected fraud, forgery, elder exploitation, obstruction, and animal cruelty," Grant protested. Ruth kept her eyes on Marianne. "You can save the speeches for the judge." Luke moved beside Ruth, no longer hiding behind procedure, but standing inside it the way an honest officer should. Marianne's hands were placed in front of her. Even then, she tried to smile at the room. No one smiled back. But the story did not end with handcuffs. It almost did. Mason could feel the room wanting that to be enough. A villain named. A lie exposed. A town relieved. But Libby, still standing near the door, suddenly turned away from Marianne and walked back to the blue mailbag at Walter's feet. Penny wriggled in Elaine's arms, gave one tiny yip, and tried to reach down. Elaine set her gently on the floor. The puppy stumbled to the bag and began worrying at a loose inner seam with her little teeth. Walter stared. "That lining!" Mason crouched. The seam had been torn before, Perhaps when Penny had bitten the bag during the struggle on Route 12. Perhaps when Libby had fought to keep it from the men who stopped Walter's truck. Mason slipped 2 fingers beneath the loosened canvas and felt paper. Red paper. Walter covered his mouth. I forgot I moved it there. Mason pulled out the envelope. It was whole. Old. Sealed with a faded mark. Not addressed to him. To Thomas Reed, if Mason ever comes home. Mason's breath caught. Walter nodded. Eli wrote it before his last mission. He asked me to give it to your father if he didn't come back. Marianne only had a torn copy. Enough to twist. Not enough to tell the truth. Mason opened the red letter in front of the town. Eli Hart's handwriting leaned across the page, alive with the warmth Mason had been grieving for 12 years. Mason read aloud, and his voice broke only once. If I don't come home, please don't let Mason believe my death was a debt. He saved me more times than he knows. He pulled me out of dark places long before any battlefield did. If I gave him anything, it was not guilt. It was time. Tell him to live it. Tell him to go home when he is tired. Tell him a brother does not die, so another man can spend the rest of his life apologizing for breathing. Mason stopped reading. There were more words, but for a moment he could not see them. The page blurred. He had spent 12 years carrying Eli's death like a sentence passed down by God. But Eli had called it time, not punishment. Not debt. Time. Walter reached for him. Mason took the old man's hand. Months later, when spring came to Brightwater Valley and the snow pulled back from the lake in silver sheets, the Reed house did not stand empty. A red mailbox stood at the front gate, freshly painted. Above the porch hung a carved wooden sign, Hart Reed Letter House. Inside were a long table, hot coffee, a stove that never stayed cold for long, shelves for old letters, and chairs for veterans, widows, retired working dogs, and anyone who had waited too long to be remembered. Walter no longer walked Route 12 alone. Mason drove him. Mabel sorted the letters. Ruth stopped by after shifts. Elaine checked on Libby and Penny more often than she admitted was necessary. Libby slept near the front door, like a guardian of second chances, and Penny grew into a clumsy, bright-eyed young dog who liked chewing Mason's bootlaces whenever he sat too still. One morning, Mason walked to the cemetery above the lake. He stood before Thomas Reed's grave with his father's final letter in his hand. His camouflage shirt moved lightly in the spring wind. His eyes were still sad, but not buried. Not anymore. He did not ask for years back. He did not promise to become perfect. He only placed one hand on the cold stone and said the words his father had waited a lifetime to hear. Dad, I stayed. And somewhere behind him, Libby gave one soft bark, as if sealing the promise. Sometimes God does not heal a man by erasing the war from his memory. Sometimes he sends a loyal dog through a blizzard, hides mercy inside an old letter, lets a father's promise survive the silence, and gives a wounded soldier one more chance to come home. Sometimes God does not send miracles in the way we expect. Sometimes he sends a loyal dog into a storm, an old letter that waited for the right heart, and a second chance for a wounded man to finally come home. In our daily lives, many of us carry regrets, unfinished words, or people we wish we had loved better. But this story reminds us that it is never too late for forgiveness, never too late to keep a promise, and never too late for God to lead us back to what truly matters. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from. And if you believe in stories of faith, loyalty, healing, and second chances, please subscribe to Seal Dog Tales. May God bless you, protect your family, and bring peace to every heart watching this story tonight.